This is take one. I'm Dr. Josh Feder. I'm a child and family psychiatrist here in Solana Beach, California. And with me is Brooke Wagner, M.A., who is a...
I'm an RDI program certified consultant and the owner of a local agency specializes in autism.
I work as Director of Research at ICDL, the Floor Time People, the Interdisciplinary Council on Developmental and Learning Disorders. And today we are here to do a brief introductory video comparing and contrasting DIR, the Developmental Individual Differences Relationship-Based Floor Time Approach, which was developed by Stanley Greenspan and Sarita Wieder, with
RDI, which is Relationship Development Intervention, that was developed by Dr. Gutstein and Dr. Shealy.
And what we thought we would do today is to build a little family and then talk about our different perspectives on that family, just for a few minutes to give you an introductory idea of what these philosophies are about and how we might look in some ways similarly and maybe in some ways a little bit differently at the same kind of situation. And because most of the kids who we're talking about typically come to us with developmental and learning challenges, often on the autism spectrum, and of course RDI was developed for autism, DIR was more brought over to autism from child development, we will build a case with somebody with autism. So we're going to erase this introductory board and we're going to build a family. So Brooke, so what do you think? Let's figure out a child. Do you want a boy? You want a girl?
Let's do a boy.
Okay, a boy. How old?
Let's do 5.
5 years old. And should we give him a name?
Sure. Let's give him the name of Simon.
Simon. Simon Baron-Cohen is actually speaking in town this week, so he'll like it. Okay, so a 5-year-old Simon, and Simon presumably has some sort of symptoms that brought him to us that are reflective of some sort of maybe autism spectrum disorder. What are the main things his parents might be concerned about?
Let's see. Simon is exhibiting some resistant behaviors.
So can you give me an example?
He is having tantrums around things changing in his world, in his environment, having a hard time responding to new dynamic opportunities.
Okay, so let's give a concrete example. Mom comes in and she says, I can't get his shoes on for school. It's the morning, it's always a problem. I'm trying to get him to his program and he won't put his shoes on. It's a tantrum and the whole house is a disaster. Just getting his shoes on, like a specific kind of transition, change, opportunity, I think we would look at it. So let's say getting shoes on. I mean, it seems sort of silly, but at least it's something to kind of hang our hats on. And what about other things about Simon that we might think about? For instance, how about his ability to communicate?
Let's say that he has a lot of static language, so he can respond in a certain way based on the skills he's been taught, but can't use language meaningfully or creatively on his own. So
great. And how well does he understand what we're talking to him about? Is he reasonable for a 5-year-old?
Let's say he's delayed, but not.
Okay, so maybe he's maybe a little bit slow to process.
Yeah, slow to process would be great.
Okay. And then what about other things about him, like sensory kinds of difficulties?
Sure.
I mean, we are talking shoes.
Yes, let's say that he has some sensitivities to textures and some resistance to certain textures.
Maybe sounds as well?
Sure. Let's do some sounds.
Okay, all right. And would we say he might be visually distractible? A lot of our kids are.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so he's got a number of difficulties with sensory modulation and processing. So this is a sketch, so it's not going to be as detailed as what one would have if we were doing a full assessment, just doing a sketch.
Right.
Okay, so he's got some sensory sensitivities, maybe some motor planning difficulties as well, so figuring out how to get things done to solve problems in the world, planning. I have a motor planning problem right there. Okay, so he's got difficulties in those areas as well. And in terms of executive function, let's say that he gets stuck. And so when I think about executive function, I think about having an idea, and then from there having a plan, and then from there having some sort of a sequence of steps, and then from there executing those steps, and then adapting your execution because it never happens the way you expect. Which kind of goes back to the tantrums and resistance. Life isn't going the way he expects, and so he's kind of falling apart. Okay, so so we've talked about sensory, motor, receptive and expressive communication, executive functioning, a little bit about visual distractibility. Maybe that's a decent piece of his, what we would call from the DIR perspective, individual differences or developmental profile from there.
Right.
And what about in terms of his, I'm going to erase this?
That's fine.
Okay, we'll try to remember it.
Right.
What about his ability to solve problems? You talked about dealing with things dynamically, dealing with a situation. So give me a little, flesh that out a little bit for me.
Yeah, I think that Simon would be a type of kid that has a hard time being able to respond to something changing. So being able to think flexibly and problem solve in the moment. So let's say that his shoes are always placed in a certain spot in the morning, and he comes to notice that his shoes have been placed somewhere else, and he has a full tantrum around that event. So that he has a hard time being able to respond in the moment when something new happens that he's not expecting.
Okay, so can you explain how that fits with the RDI philosophy?
Absolutely. So that would be something that we would consider that we would need to take a closer look at how he's processing situations and be able to come up with a plan on how we can help him be able to handle these kinds of situations, dynamic life opportunities that happen to all of us on a regular basis, in a way that's successful for him so that he feels competent and feels like he can problem solve and make that discovery and learn that these kinds of things happen in life and that we can respond to them and we can handle them and we can be successful with them. So, and actually the ultimate goal from an RDI perspective would be that he wouldn't just tolerate change, but he would value change. And so things like that would be would come very naturally to him, that he would be able to respond fluidly, dynamically, in a creative way and in a mindful way, and really value change and want change ultimately in the future.
So do you have maybe a quick, I can give you the pen, either whatever you want. Do you have like a couple different pieces that you might present to any parent saying these are the things that we're going to be thinking about? Go ahead and give us that.
Sure. The thing.
Can you write it while you do it?
Sure. It might be hard for me to write it. Spelling. The main concept that we were thinking about in RDI is dynamic intelligence.
Okay.
Okay. So we want to, and I'm just going to abbreviate here. We want to, really focus on dynamic intelligence across the board, and we found that our kids on the spectrum oftentimes have a hard time with dynamic intelligence, and their static intelligence is generally high. Not all the time, but a lot of the time.
So by dynamic intelligence and static intelligence, can you define those a little bit more?
Sure. So dynamic intelligence is the way we respond to things changing in our environment, being able to think flexibly and problem solve, being able to adjust in the moment to appraise situations and come up with a different route, a different plan because of the new information that we gathered. It's also being able to take past experiences that we've discovered and learned from and apply them when something is similar but different in the future. So it really does develop a sense of self of who we are, and it gives us opportunities to become more self-aware, and it really helps us to self-regulate. So it's important to have dynamic intelligence so that we can navigate the ever-changing world around us.
And you would contrast that with static intelligence, which is more...
Static intelligence is more where there's a clear-cut response, and we want to memorize things. We want to rely on things. For an example, you're always going to stop at a red light. You're never going to want people to think that that's an option to be flexible with. So those are areas that we want to have a static response. We want to have an expected response because it's important in those cases to have that. But in our world, dynamic intelligence is the vast majority of how we process situations. So we really want to take a look at our kids and think about how their static intelligence is generally pretty high or in place at a good level, and really work on the weakness area, which is the dynamic intelligence.
Beautiful. Okay, so you speak to developing dynamic intelligence, and give us a quick outline of how you approach that with Simon and his shoes.
Oh, absolutely. Well, the big thing about RDI is that we wouldn't look at it as the skill or behavioral level. We would look beyond the behavior. So we wouldn't want to just teach him how to put his shoes on, because to us that's not really the breakdown. The breakdown is how he's processing that situation. And so we want to look at all areas of his life and try to problem solve how this breakdown is affecting him. So if it's related to dynamic intelligence, in this case, let's say he's having a hard time with knowing where to put his shoes on and how to process and navigate that whole step-by-step process. We would want to think about giving him opportunities, and we may or may not start with shoes. We would probably start with something we felt he could be most successful with, bring it down to a level that he could be right at that edge of his competence, and take him one step above it with appropriate support, so that he could make that discovery himself, and we're not prompting him through the whole step-by-step process.
Okay, so maybe a couple buzzwords would be what?
For dynamic intelligence would be,
or
to work on
for
it.
the process of how we're going to work with this.
Yeah, it would be to create a careful learning environment. We would want to put him one step above his confidence level.
So not so far that it overwhelms him.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
And one that gives him the chance to make the discovery, so that he's processing the situation. We're not doing the thinking for him. We want him to do the thinking. So we want him to process the situation, make the discovery, and be able to apply it, so that next time a situation comes up that's similar, he can use that experience and run with it.
Beautiful. That reminds me a lot of what Ed Tronick talks about, where you've got a situation where you've got a break in the communication between people, sort of a mismatch, and then if there's an experience of repair of that, and if that happens over and over and over again, it builds the confidence in one's own competence to problem solve.
Exactly.
So I get it.
Yeah,
got it.
exactly.
So I'll give you the sort of the DIR verbiage on the same situation. So you've got the shoes, and you've got the crying, and our first response really patterns along what we call the functional, emotional, developmental levels. I know it's sort of a mouthful. I'll write it out. Functional, emotional, developmental levels, or otherwise known as FEDL. And now I'm going to erase it right away so I can talk about this. And really, there are three, in my mind, the quick way to remember this is that there are three basic thoughts about these things. So what we mean by functional, emotional, developmental levels are the ways in which, as we develop as people, but also in every situation, the things we need to do to be able to respond adaptively. And the first is to be reasonably regulated, because if you're not, it's impossible to be able to think and problem solve. The second thing is really the human thing. It's to be engaged with other people affectively, emotionally in the process. So the thought behind that, the philosophy behind that, is that we learn through our interactions with others. If we're sort of problem solving on our own, for instance, if you have the same child and he's got his Lego set and he puts it together just great, that's lovely, it's good. It's back sort of to that static intelligence that you're talking about. But it's not necessarily adaptive, because the truth is that the world is bigger than us, and we actually need each other to be able to problem solve. So you need to be regulated, engaged, and then the third actually goes 3rd through 15, but to summarize it, it's to create some kind of flow of interaction that's ever more complex and at later stages becomes symbolic and logical and makes it possible to be able to withstand the slings and arrows of everyday life and to be able to problem solve together. So with this same child, what we might do is he's crying, so we would start by trying to help him be regulated, and really we would have an empathic kind of response to him, you know, soothing kind of response. You know, I know this is really hard for you. And maybe he's really tantruming a lot, so we have to wait. Sometimes he's already over the top. But once he's kind of settled down, I know this is really hard. And then try to figure out how we can become engaged and maybe even start playing about, you know, this kind of situation. Maybe not in the situation itself, maybe at another time when we're thinking about the shoes and how that's hard and maybe planning for the next time. And over time, doing in a similar way to you, helping create situations in which the child is taking the lead, and we're helping the child to problem solve and connecting with them and go in a flow of interaction so that they have within themselves this history of our relationship and this history of somehow getting through these problems. And so the idea is that when you do this, we call this floor time, whether it's on the floor or in interaction, that people become better able to withstand, they become more resilient to things like the shoes. Now that doesn't mean that you're not going to have lots of situations, I think we would agree, where people have expectations. And I think that's what gives our philosophies a contrast with the more strict behavioral philosophies, because when we're looking at these expectations of I want to play and I don't want to put my shoes on, or I expect that the shoes are going to hurt my feet, or I expect that the shoes are going to be here when they're there, it's always this mismatch and then falling apart immediately.
Right.
And so from our point of view, and again I think we agree because we've spent hours talking about these things, instead of training someone to receive an external reward for tolerating the expectation, which actually is useful, it's helpful, and works for certain things. Learning how to stop at a stop sign, learning to be a firefighter, all these kinds of things require that you go through and do these explicit kinds of things to solve problems in the moment. Rescuing someone from a fire, you have to know how to get your equipment out. Instead, we try to expect the unexpected, right? So we prepare for that. So the philosophy is that nothing happens as expected. And if we, over time, remember that ourselves and help the child understand that nothing happens as expected, over time the child comes to see it as the same game that we see, whether we're going into traffic or we're going through our class schedule at school, that whatever is happening, it's never going to be exactly like we expect, and then the game is, how is it a little bit different, and what do we want to do about it?
I think one thing I would add to that too, and something that Dr. Goodstein has mentioned, that we're trying to restructure the neural architecture so that when the children are processing these situations in this way, in a dynamic way that we're both talking about, that they can apply what they discovered in the future. And so that they're not just learning a set of skills, but they're actually changing the way that their brain is processing situations. And so they no longer are responding with these breakdowns because they can now change the way that they are actually seeing these situations and then applying what they've learned.
It's important to know that both of these approaches, these developmental approaches, are based in well-founded research. So in the world of evidence-based practice, where we take relevant research and use our clinical judgment to help families make their choices about what kinds of options they want to use in helping their kids, we are among the evidence-based research practices for people with developmental and learning disorders, autism in particular. And we do have research coming out, particularly of York University, showing brain change when people have this kind of approach to their problems. So, for instance, in the York studies, 2 hours a week, actually, of coaching parents to work with their children using the floor time method demonstrated changes in the brains of kids as they responded to the intervention. So we're very excited
Incredible.
about how research is supporting what clinically we've observed for many years, and we'll be excited to come back perhaps with another case or more detailed explanations of our philosophies in a later broadcast. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Have a great day.
All right.
Thanks, Brooke.
Thank you.